The lens of history often focuses on the monster, the final, terrifying form of a killer. But what if we zoom out, push past the sensational headlines, to the very beginning? What if we could listen to the echoes of a scream that began long before the first shot was ever fired? Our story begins not on a lonely highway, but in a world of profound and systemic betrayal. A childhood so shattered it became the blueprint for a killer. The story of Aileen Wuornos, born Eileen Carol Pittman, is a tragic cycle of abandonment and abuse. Her birth on February 29, 1956, was not a cause for celebration, but a consequence of neglect. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a man already steeped in darkness, a convicted child molester who, at the time of Eileen's birth, was a suspect in a horrifying series of murders. He would later be institutionalized and take his own life, a ghost of violence that would forever haunt her lineage. Her mother, Diane Pittman, was little more than a child herself, a frightened teenager unprepared for the responsibilities of motherhood, unable to care for her infant daughter, and with a son already in tow, she quickly cast Eileen and her older brother, Keith, adrift into a life they did not choose. The boys and girls of today, with their vibrant imaginations and dreams, are so often shaped by the love and support of a family. Eileen and Keith's story, however, was written in the ink of an unfeeling hand. They were handed over to their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos, in Troy, Michigan. It was here, in a home that should have been a sanctuary, that the seeds of her future violence were planted and nurtured. The Wuornos household was not one of warmth and affection, but of cold judgment and unyielding rigidity. Theirs was a world built on punishment, not praise, where a child's natural curiosity was met with suspicion and their innocence was seen as a weakness to be purged. The abuse was not a singular event, but a relentless and brutal way of life. Her grandfather, Lori, was a man consumed by alcohol and rage. He subjected Eileen to constant physical beatings, each blow a fresh reminder of her supposed worthlessness. The verbal cruelty was a poison, a slow-acting venom that chipped away at her soul, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a human being. The psychological wounds were as deep and scarring as the physical ones. But the most profound and soul-crushing trauma was the sexual abuse, which began at an early age. The violation she endured, not only at the hands of her grandfather, but also from his friends, was a systematic and calculated destruction of her spirit. Her body was a territory to be exploited, her mind a fortress to be broken, and her voice a sound to be silenced. This was a childhood defined by a constant state of fear, betrayal, and a deep-seated helplessness. A world where the people who were supposed to protect her were the very ones who inflicted the most pain. The psychological fallout from this relentless trauma was devastating and irreversible. By the time she was a teenager, Eileen had been stripped of any sense of self-worth. Her life had been a series of rejections and brutal violations, teaching her a singular, terrible lesson: that people were not to be trusted, that love was a lie, and that the world was an inherently hostile and dangerous place. The trauma had left her with a profound sense of worthlessness, a deep well of pain that would later boil over into an uncontrollable rage. The constant state of fear and betrayal she had lived in had forged an impenetrable wall around her heart, a defense mechanism that would eventually isolate her from any genuine human connection. The screams of her childhood, unheard and unacknowledged, would eventually echo in the silence of her victims, a dark and terrifying testament to a life defined by a legacy of violence. The unforgiving road, cast out the echo of a scream, had faded, replaced by the silence of a life in a journey set in motion by the very people who should have provided a safe harbor. At the tender age of 14, Aileen Wuornos was cast out into the world, a world she had been taught to fear and distrust. Her life, for all its brevity, had already been a relentless series of betrayals. But this new chapter would be an unforgiving road, a relentless struggle for survival that would solidify her belief that the world was a place of predatory darkness. The first profound event that solidified her sense of alienation and shame was a devastatingly common occurrence in the lives of the abuse. Pregnancy. At the age of 13, a child herself, she became pregnant after a brutal rape. For a young girl already burdened with the weight of her traumatic past, this event was a public and painful reminder of her vulnerability. She gave the baby up for adoption, an act that, while perhaps born of necessity, deepened her sense of shame and alienation. The child she could not keep was another ghost in her life, a silent testament to a world that offered only pain and rejection. This new trauma, piled on top of all the others, created a wound that would never fully heal, leaving her with an even deeper sense of being fundamentally unworthy and unlovable. Following the pregnancy, the Wuornos household, already a place of cold judgment, became a space of outright rejection. Her grandparents, unable or unwilling to deal with the public shame of her condition, threw her out of their home permanently. At 14, Aileen was left to fend for herself on the streets, an emotional and physical orphan in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. She was a child with a woman's body, burdened with an old woman's pain, with no resources and no one to turn to. She was a runaway, a statistic, a lost soul on the highway of America, forced to rely on her wits and a fierce, rebellious independence to survive. Her existence became a transient one. She became a hitchhiker, a wanderer on a perpetual journey between Florida and Georgia, the warm, humid air of the South, a stark contrast to the cold reality of her daily life. Her days were a desperate and grinding struggle for survival. She slept rough, in the woods, under bridges, and in the abandoned shells of buildings. To stay alive, she resorted to petty crimes, theft to get a meal, public intoxication to numb the constant gnawing of her pain. Her life was a blur of fleeting encounters and dangerous situations, each new day a fight to simply exist. The men who picked her up were a constant threat, and she quickly learned to read the subtle signs of danger, to anticipate the intentions that lurked behind a friendly smile. The streets, unforgiving and harsh, became her school. She learned a terrible but useful set of lessons: that people were not to be trusted, that genuine kindness was a rare and often deceptive commodity, and that the only person she could truly rely on was herself. This education forged a fierce, rebellious independence, a defiant streak that would later be misinterpreted as a sign of her inherent evil. But while the streets taught her to be strong, they also built an impenetrable wall around her heart. She became an island, isolated from any possibility of genuine human connection. The wall she built was a shield, a necessary defense against a world that had only ever hurt her, but it also trapped her in a prison of her own, making a solitary existence where her pain had no outlet and her deep-seated rage had nowhere to go but inward, simmering beneath the surface, until it was ready to explode. The girl who was cast out had become a woman hardened by her journey, a product of a world that had failed her at every turn. A false hope, a brief respite life on the road, a cycle of desperation and danger had become her grim reality. Yet, even in the depths of a transient existence, the human heart holds a stubborn flicker of hope, a desperate longing for something more. For Aileen Wuornos, that flicker materialized in the form of a man named Louis Gratz-Fell, a chance encounter that promised to be her escape, a new beginning that would finally offer her the stability and love she had been denied her entire life. At the age of 20, Aileen met Louis, a wealthy, much older man who was captivated by her wild, untamed spirit. He saw a vulnerable young woman, not a damaged one, and offered her a life she could only have dreamed of. For a brief, intoxicating period, Aileen believed this marriage would be her salvation. She saw it as her opportunity to shed the skin of her past, the pain, the poverty, the constant struggle, and to step into a world of normalcy. The quiet hope she held was palpable. She hoped that Louis's love could be the antidote to the poison of her childhood, the embrace that would finally mend her shattered psyche. She married him, a desperate act of faith, believing that this man, with his wealth and stability, could be the one to save her. But the scars of a lifetime of trauma run deep, and a few weeks of marriage were not enough to erase them. Her deep-seated trauma and volatile nature made a conventional life impossible. The constant state of fear and betrayal she had lived in had left her unable to trust, and her simmering rage made even simple arguments into explosive confrontations. The normal life she had so desperately craved was an alien concept. The marriage, a brief and fragile respite, imploded in a matter of weeks. The final, painful moment came when she was arrested for assaulting him. An act of violence born not of malice, but of the raw, uncontained pain that was her constant companion. The illusion of a happy ending shattered, leaving her once again on the outside looking in. The annulment of the marriage and her swift return to the streets was a devastating blow. It was a betrayal more profound than any she had experienced before, because it was a betrayal of her own hopes. It reinforced every terrible lesson she had ever learned about herself, that she was fundamentally unlovable, unworthy of a stable life, and incapable of ever finding true happiness. The promise of a future she had glimpsed had been a mirage, and the reality of her life was an ever-present, grinding pain. The pain of the annulment was not just the end of a marriage, it was the death of a dream. This experience erased any remaining hope she had for a conventional life. It was the final descent into a darkness from which she would never return. A sense of betrayal and rejection, now a consuming inferno, fueled an even deeper rage. The Louis Gratzfeld marriage was a brief window into a world of possibility that was violently slammed shut in her face. The experience pushed her further down a path of self-destruction, away from the light and into the shadows. The girl who had once hoped for a fairy tale ending was gone, replaced by a woman who believed that the only way to survive was to live in a world of her own making, a world where she could finally be the one to inflict the pain instead of receiving it. Her journey on the road had taught her to be a survivor. The failed marriage taught her that she would never be a part of the world she had been fighting to join. The tipping point. The path of least resistance. The false hope of a conventional life had been a painful mirage. The marriage, a brief and fragile dream, had shattered, leaving Aileen more broken than before. Her return to the streets was not a retreat, but a final, bitter acknowledgement of her place in the world. She had tried to escape her past, to build a future, and had been violently rebuffed. The fury of this final rejection hardened her heart, and she returned to Florida, a familiar landscape of transience and survival. It was here, in the sun-drenched, humid expanse of the South, that the simmering rage of her childhood would finally find its fatal outlet. She adopted the name Aileen Wuornos, a final shedding of the identity she had been born with, a symbolic act of severing ties with a past she could not bear to remember. She was no longer Eileen Carol Pittman, the abused child. She was Aileen Wuornos, a woman on the run from her own history. It was during this period that she met Tyria Moore, a woman with whom she began a relationship. For a time, Tyria represented a different kind of hope of companionship that was not based on the traditional, heteronormative ideal of her failed marriage, but on a shared existence on the fringes of society. She found in Tyria a sense of belonging, a partner in her transient life. This new connection, however, would become a double-edged sword, providing not only companionship but also a desperate need for financial stability. To support herself and Tyria, Aileen became a prostitute, hitchhiking along the highways of Florida. It was a life she had been forced into before, but now it was different. She had a new, consuming motivation: to provide for the one person who had not yet betrayed her. She saw the men she met not as clients, but as a representation of all the men who had abused and wronged her. They were a faceless, interchangeable mass of patriarchal oppression, a symbol of the constant violation and pain she had endured since childhood. Each encounter was a transaction of power, a fleeting moment of control in a life where she had been powerless. The money she earned was a testament to her survival, a bitter currency forged from the wreckage of her own humanity. Aileen started carrying a gun, a .22 caliber handgun she kept tucked away. She claimed it was for self-defense against her clients, a rational and necessary precaution in a dangerous profession. In her mind, the gun was not an instrument of aggression, but a weapon of defense. It was a tangible symbol of her refusal to be a victim any longer. She had been the prey for so long. Now, she was the hunter. The line between protecting herself and inflicting harm began to blur, a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of her moral boundaries. The rage that had been simmering beneath the surface for decades was now dangerously close to boiling over, waiting for the smallest spark to ignite. That spark came in the form of Richard Mallory, the first man she killed. She picked him up, and in the dark and lonely stretches of a Florida highway, the pent-up fury of a lifetime of abuse finally erupted. She would later claim he was going to rape her, and that she acted in self, a story she would cling to for the rest of her life. Regardless of the absolute truth of that single encounter, the act itself gave her a sense of power and control she had never felt before. The violence she had endured had finally been turned back on the world that had inflicted it. The murder of Richard Mallory was not just a crime. It was a psychological turning point, a terrifying act of liberation that set her on a deadly path. The woman who had been a victim for so long had finally found a way to reclaim her power, and the world would never be the same. The highway of death, the murder spree, the murder of Richard Mallory, was more than an isolated act of violence. It was the chilling prelude to a reign of terror that would soon sweep across the highways of Florida. The first killing had unlocked a dark sense of power and control in Aileen Wuornos, a feeling so intoxicating that she was compelled to repeat it. The line between self-defense and cold-blooded murder had blurred beyond recognition, and with each subsequent victim, she spiraled deeper into a cycle of violence that would cement her place as one of America's most notorious serial killers. Following the Mallory murder, Aileen embarked on a spree of violence that spanned over a year, a grim journey that mirrored the transient life she had always led. Her method became a terrifyingly consistent pattern. She would hitchhike along lonely stretches of highway, get picked up by a male driver, and then, in the dark confines of their vehicle or a desolate wooded area, she would rob and murder them. The victims' bodies were callously abandoned in remote locations, left to be discovered by chance, or not at all. It was a methodical and brutal process, driven by a newfound sense of power and a cold financial desperation. The victims of her spree were a diverse group of men, a fact that initially baffled law enforcement. They were not from a consistent demographic, which made it difficult for police to connect the seemingly random deaths. There was David Spears, an Air Force veteran, whose body was discovered stripped of its valuables. There was Charles Koskinen, a rodeo worker, whose vehicle was later found abandoned. There was Peter Seams, a businessman, whose body was never found, though his car was recovered after a car chase with police. And there was Troy Barras, a retired police chief, whose death was particularly shocking to the community. The list of victims went on, each one a stark reminder of the indiscriminate nature of her violence. The lack of a consistent victim profile initially made the case a complex puzzle, a mystery that would take months to solve. The murders were carried out with a .22 caliber handgun, a small but deadly weapon that had become her tool of trade. After shooting the men, she would take their wallets, cars, and any other possessions of value. She later sold these items for cash, the blood money used to support herself and her girlfriend, Tyria Moore. The motivation was a twisted combination of financial desperation and a brutal, almost ritualistic, act of revenge against agenda she had come to despise. The violence she inflicted on others was a grim echo of the violence she had endured her entire life, a cycle of pain that had come full circle. Throughout the killing spree, Aileen maintained that she was a victim, not a monster. In a series of conversations with Tyria, and later with the police, she would repeat the same defense. She had only killed in self. She claimed that each of the men had either threatened to rape her, beat her, or kill her, and that she was simply fighting for her life. The legal and emotional weight of her claims would be a central point of her trial, a complex and controversial argument that would attempt to reframe her as a survivor rather than a killer. But the sheer number of victims and the cold, methodical nature of the crimes made her claims increasingly difficult to believe. While the public saw a ruthless killer, Aileen's private life was a constant state of paranoia and fear. The violence she inflicted on others was a reflection of her inner turmoil. She was perpetually on the run, using new names and becoming increasingly isolated. Her relationship with Tyria Moore, once a source of comfort, became strained under the weight of her crimes. The violence she had unleashed on the world had also turned inward, creating a deep well of anxiety and psychological distress. The killing spree was a terrifying manifestation of her fractured psyche, a journey that led her down a path of self-destruction and, ultimately, to her own demise. The highway of death was not just a road she traveled, it was a reflection of the darkness she had carried within her for so long. The unraveling. The manhunt and capture the highway of death had been a grim and lonely one, but the string of seemingly random murders had not gone unnoticed. Law enforcement agencies in multiple Florida counties were baffled by the unconnected deaths, but a key breakthrough came when an FBI profiler noted the chilling consistency in the method of murder. All the victims were male motorists. All were found stripped of their valuables, and all had been shot with a small caliber handgun. The realization that they were dealing with a single killer a rare female serial killer, changed the entire nature of the investigation. A key break came when fingerprints from one of the victim's stolen belongings, a stereo, were matched to a woman with a prior criminal record. Aileen Wuornos. The hunt was on, as the prime suspect, Aileen's girlfriend, Tyria Moore, became a central figure in the investigation. The police, unable to link Tyria directly to the murders, saw her as the key to Aileen's capture and confession. They knew that Tyria was not an accomplice, but a potential witness and a vulnerable point in Aileen's armor. The investigator's strategy was as simple as it was effective. They convinced Tyria to cooperate, promising her full immunity in exchange for her help in getting a confession from Aileen. Tyria, caught between her loyalty to Aileen and her own fear of being implicated in the murders, reluctantly agreed. The police set up a series of recorded phone calls and meetings between the two women. The confession tapes that followed are a dramatic and emotional record of Aileen's psychological unraveling. The tapes captured the raw and desperate moments as under immense pressure, attempted to get Aileen to admit to the crimes. Aileen's self-defense story, which she had so fiercely clung to, slowly began to crack under the weight of Tyria's questioning and her own guilt. In a series of halting admissions, she began to admit to the crimes, each one a painful and terrifying step away from the narrative she had so carefully constructed. The tapes were a powerful and damning piece of evidence, a raw glimpse into the mind of a killer who was both defiant and deeply broken. With the confession tape secured, a statewide manhunt was launched for Aileen. She was a woman on the run, using aliases and living in hiding, a shadow on the edge of a world she had so brutally assaulted. The search culminated in a quiet, almost anticlimactic arrest at a biker bar in Volusia County, Florida, where she had been staying. Her capture was calm and without incident, a stark contrast to the violence she had unleashed on the highways. The woman who had been a symbol of a brutal, untamed rage was now a quiet, compliant prisoner. Her capture made headlines across the country and the world. The media, in its insatiable hunger for a story, quickly dubbed her the Killer Queen and the Damsel of Death. Her story, that of a female serial killer, was a novelty, a dark and fascinating inversion of the traditional male-dominated narrative of violence. The public's fascination with her story and the media's sensational portrayal solidified her image as a cold-blooded monster. The complexities of her childhood abuse, the psychological trauma, and the systemic failures that had led her to this point were overshadowed by the gruesome headlines and the public's desire to understand the mind of a killer. The story of Aileen Wuornos had moved from the shadows of the highways to the glaring, unforgiving light of the public eye. The trial of the monster. Conviction and public image. The capture of Aileen Wuornos had brought the story of the highway killings to a sensational climax. But the next act of her trial would be an even bigger media circus. Her first trial for the killing of Richard Mallory was held in a small Florida courthouse, but it attracted a global audience. Reporters and cameras from around the world descended on the town, eager to cover the trial of America's first female serial killer. The public was captivated by the spectacle, a morbid fascination with a woman who had dared to break one of the most fundamental societal taboos. The trial was not just a legal proceeding, it was a performance, and the defendant, a damaged and deeply troubled woman, was the unwilling star. The prosecution's case was as straightforward as it was damning. They painted Aileen as a ruthless, cold-blooded killer who murdered for profit. They used her criminal record, her lack of remorse on the confession tapes, and the brutal nature of the crimes to argue for a first-degree murder conviction. They presented her as a predator, not a victim, a woman who killed simply to steal cars and money. The prosecution's narrative was simple, clean, and terrifyingly effective. They presented a clear line from her past crimes to the current ones, framing her as a woman who had always been on the wrong side of the law, a person for whom violence was simply another tool of trade. They did not delve into the complexities of her past. They focused on the brutal, undeniable facts of the present. The defense, led by her court-appointed attorney, attempted to counter this narrative with a complex and emotionally charged argument. They argued that Aileen was a victim of a lifetime of abuse, and that the murders were a desperate act of self. They presented evidence of her traumatic past, the childhood abuse, the rape, the constant betrayal as the root cause of her actions. They argued that her life had been a series of violations, and that the men she killed had simply been the final, terrifying manifestation of her lifelong torment. The defense tried to reframe the narrative, to present Aileen as a survivor who had been pushed to her absolute breaking point. They presented her claims that each of the men had threatened her life as a genuine and believable fear, a natural reaction for a woman who had been violated her entire life. Despite the defense's impassioned efforts, the jury was not swayed. The media had already branded her a monster, and the evidence, the string of dead bodies, the stolen property, and the chilling admissions on the confession tapes was overwhelming. After a short deliberation, the jury found Aileen Wuornos guilty of first-degree murder and recommended the death penalty. She was later convicted of 5 more murders and received additional death sentences, a grim and final confirmation of her fate. The verdict was a public confirmation of the prosecution's narrative. The legal system had deemed her a killer, not a victim. The trials cemented Aileen's image as a monster in the public's mind. The media's portrayal of her as an unrepentant killer overshadowed the underlying issues of trauma and abuse that had defined her life. The public narrative was often at odds with the complex reality of her story, but it was a more palatable one. It was easier to see her as a cold-blooded killer than to confront the uncomfortable truth that a lifetime of trauma and systemic neglect could turn a child into a monster. The story of Aileen Wuornos became a cautionary tale, a gruesome spectacle that served as a public condemnation of her crimes, and a powerful reinforcement of the idea that some people are simply born evil. A narrative that conveniently ignored the painful and complex reality of her origins. The final confession. Death row and execution, the trials had ended. The verdicts had been delivered, and the media circus had moved on. But for Aileen Wuornos, her life had entered its final, grim chapter. She was sent to death row in Florida, a cold and unforgiving place where she would spend the next decade of her life. Her time there was marked by a series of erratic and often contradictory interviews with the media. In some, she maintained her innocence, clinging to the fragile self-defense story that had failed her in court. In others, she confessed to the murders, even expressing a chilling desire to die, as if her life had become a burden she could no longer bear. These interviews, filled with her bizarre and often unhinged ramblings, offered a final, public glimpse into her fractured psyche, a mind torn between a desperate need for redemption and a chilling acceptance of her own damnation. Her legal team, despite her increasingly erratic behavior, attempted to have her death sentence overturned. They cited her history of mental illness and her diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, a condition that they argued made her incapable of rational thought and therefore unfit for execution. They argued that she was a victim of a system that had failed to recognize and treat her profound psychological trauma. The question of her competency became a central point of debate. Was she sane enough to be executed? The state of Florida, in a decision that sparked widespread debate and controversy, deemed her sane enough to be put to death. Her lawyer's final attempts to appeal were met with resistance, not just from the state, but from Aileen herself. In the final months of her life, Aileen dismissed her lawyers and dropped all her appeals. It was a shocking and baffling decision that signaled her complete and utter surrender. She told the court and the media that she wanted to get on with it and be with Jesus, a chilling statement that was both a sign of her religious conversion and a final, desperate cry for peace. Her decision to give up her fight for life was a stark and tragic turn of events. It was an acceptance of her fate, a final acknowledgement that her life had become an unfixable mess, and that the only way to find peace was through death. It was a final, desperate act of control in a life that had always been out of her control. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. Her final words, delivered with a strange and unsettling theatricality, were a final bizarre glimpse into her fractured psyche. "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." Her final moments were a grotesque mixture of pop, culture references, and religious fervor. A final, unhinged performance that left those in attendance with more questions than answers. The curtain had fallen on her tragic life, but her story and its legacy would live on. Aileen Wuornos' story remains a complex and controversial one. She is remembered as one of the most notorious female serial killers in American history. A woman who broke the stereotype of the male-dominated world of serial murder. But her life also serves as a tragic case study of the devastating effects of childhood abuse and the failures of the legal and mental health systems. Her life was a cascade of trauma and betrayal, a story that began with a scream and ended in silence. She was a product of a world that failed her at every turn, a monster created by the very system that had promised to protect her. Her legacy is not just one of violence and death, but a grim and powerful reminder of the complexities of human psychology and the deep and often unhealable wounds of a broken childhood.